mountains, and shall be raised above the hills. All the nations shall stream to it. Many peoples shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth instruction, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations, and shall arbitrate for many peoples. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. O house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Reading from Romans. You know what time it is, how it is now the moment for you to wake from sleep. For salvation is nearer to us now than when we became believers. The night is far gone, the day is near. Let us then lay aside the works of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let us live honorably as in the day, not in reveling and drunkenness, not in debauchery and licentiousness, not in quarreling and jealousy. Instead, put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to gratify its desires. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
The Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to Matthew.
Glory to you, Lord Christ.
Jesus said to his disciples, About that day and hour no one knows, neither the angels of heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. For as in the days of Noah were, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing until the flood came and swept them all away. So too will be the coming of the Son of Man. Then two will be in the field, one will be taken and one will be left. Two women will be grinding meal together, one will be taken and one will be left. Keep awake, therefore, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into. Therefore, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an unexpected hour. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
Last weekend, I shared with you that Peggy and Dottie and I had attended a border summit up in Tucson, and that we had been inundated with a lot of information and emotions because of that summit, where a wide variety of people on all spectrums of the issue of what is happening at our borders were there to share ministries that they're doing, encounters, stories, the challenges that we are facing. And it was 3 days of just intense information and emotions, and Dottie and Peggy and I needed some time to sort of sort through that so that we could share a little bit with you, and that is what we are planning to do this morning. Now, we have just turned to a new year in the church. We went from year C to now year A, and we'll be hearing mostly from Matthew with a little bit of John sprinkled throughout. And as I mentioned before, the lessons are speaking to us about the coming of Christ, his first coming and his second coming. And so the lessons each week will be talking a little bit about both of those prophecies and events that have happened. Our lessons this morning in Isaiah, the future time of the Messiah is described as a time of peoples drawn to Jerusalem and to the Messiah, a time of teaching and instruction and right judgment, a time of peace when war will be no more. The psalm today expresses a desire for a time when all the tribes, all the peoples will live in unity and peace and quietness and prosperity, that those who go up to Jerusalem do so to praise God's holy name. The lessons from Romans and Matthew sound a warning to the people. When Jesus returns and judges the peoples, it would be better if we were found to be living according to God's commands for us. Paul's letter encourages us to stop living in ways that do not lead to God, and to rather change and live in God's light and love. And Jesus, in his description of when he will return, tells his followers that no one knows except the Father when that will be, but that it will come at an unexpected time. In our creed each Sunday, we say, Jesus will come again in glory to judge the living and the dead, and his kingdom will have no end. So there will be a day, an unknown day and time, when Jesus will come and I will need to give an accounting of how I spent my life. Did I love God with all my heart and soul and strength and mind? Did I love my neighbors? Did I treat my neighbors the way that I would want to be treated in their place? Did I do the right things to the least of these, remembering that what I do to the least of my fellow men and women, I do to Christ? I wanted to spend just a few minutes with a few things that stood out for me from the Border Summit that touch on how I myself am treating my neighbors, how we as a people should treat our neighbors. The first thing that we did on Thursday was we went down to Nogales, and there we went to the border, and we were shown a place where the fence is. We stayed on the U.S. side, but you could look through the slats of the fence to the other side of Nogales into Mexico. And there's a place there where back in 2010, a young boy, 16 years old, was, if you look through the fence, it's not level with where the U.S. side is. It drops down about a story or so down to the street, and then across the street there are buildings, houses, and so forth. And on the opposite side of the street, down a story or so, on the wall there is a painting of a young man, and there are some flowers and crosses and things. That picture is of the young man who, in 2010, was throwing rocks uphill at the fence at some of the border agents and police on the U.S. side. Not really with much effect, I don't think, because the policemen that were there didn't seem to feel threatened. But this one Border Patrol agent has testified that he felt that his life was in danger, and he drew his weapon and shot through the fence the young boy, 16 years old, in the head, in the chest, and he fell, and he continued to empty his weapon, and then he reloaded and shot him some more after he was already dead. The cameras along the wall conveniently lost the footage. In both the criminal trial and the civil trial, the Border Patrol agent was acquitted. And there is some silk flowers tied to the fence where this happened so that you can look through and see where he was, where he died. How do we train our Border Patrol officers to refrain from deadly force when it is not necessary? Deacon Roger Babnew, who works at St. Andrew's in Nogales, has been working with his counterparts in the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America and the United Church of Christ to house and feed and help with legal assistance those families that are coming to our borders seeking asylum. And the biggest need that he says he faces on a continual basis is buying food for these folks. He finds that donations of money allows him to buy the food more inexpensively on the Mexican side at certain markets, and he buys the food and takes it to the shelters, and those that are staying in the shelters prepare it themselves. They do the work of cooking and feeding themselves, cleaning up after themselves, cooking up and cleaning all the utensils and so forth. He just needs to purchase the food to get it to them. How can we help in response to Jesus' plea that when he was hungry, we gave him something to eat. One of the Border Patrol officers spoke about their role and the difficulty of having compassion and yet having to uphold the laws and the regulations that come from Washington and the White House. How they have to sometimes use their own money to buy the necessities for the detained immigrants. And how they have identified human traffickers and drug smugglers and potential terrorists trying to cross in the midst of the chaos that is happening at the border. How can we do better at screening those who truly seek asylum from those using the chaos to attempt illegal and terrorist actions? How do we do justice in a better way? At one point we saw a video of some Border Patrol officers who, out in the desert, gleefully emptied gallon containers of fresh water that had been left there for those who have crossed over illegally into the desert, but who face dying of thirst and dehydration. There are various humanitarian organizations that take these jugs of water out into the desert to try and prevent people from dying. How do we uphold humanitarian aid as a part of our baptismal vows to respect the dignity of every living being? We heard stories of people who fled from the drug cartels and the gangs in Central America because the young boys are forced to become part of the gangs or cartels, and the girls are faced with being raped and forced into serving the men, and if they refuse, they are shot and killed. Mothers and fathers taking kids thousands of miles on a journey, or worse, sending their kids, sometimes as young as babies and toddlers, alone on that journey to try and save them from a life of crime and death. At the border, sometimes they will surrender their children to the authorities and let themselves be deported just so their kids can hopefully be saved and live in the United States. How do we show mercy for those facing impossible choices of a life of crime or death? These are just a few of the things that impacted me in this summit. There were many more, but I want to allow some time so that Dottie and Peggy can have a chance to share some of what they felt and experienced at this summit. So I'll be back in a minute. Dottie?
Well, last night I had a t-shirt on that said across the front in English, "God has no borders." On the back it was said the same thing in Spanish. I had gotten it back in the early 2000s when Bishop Smith had taken a whole bunch of people from the diocese, including a lot of us from St. Stephen's, down to the border. We marched along what there was of the border wall at the time and stopped where it stopped. And people from the Mexican side were also there waiting, marching along on their side and waiting there. And we shared with their bishop and our bishop consecrating bread and wine, and we shared communion across the border. It was a very joyful time, and every day that week there was something else going on also down there, although we only went that day. But some people went down and played volleyball over the wall with the people and things like that. It was a joyful time. Well, I've been across the border other times since, but this time, although we didn't go across the border, but standing at that spot on the wall in Nogales where that young boy had been killed just terrified me. And it was such deep emotion that it was really hard to take, hearing the story over again after having heard it, of course, when it happened. Reverend Deacon Roger Babnew, as you just heard from, works for Cruzando Fronteras organization, explained to us that the mesh wire that is now on the wall was added to prevent families from passing food and letters, and even touching hands of their family through the bars of that wall. And now also, concertina wire has been added across the top and down partway on the sides to prevent ladders from going up and going over. They could clip the wire and still do it, but I don't imagine too many are trying to do that. It was just a very sad, ugly sight. And I'm sure that people in Berlin felt the same way about their wall before it came down. Hopefully this wall will someday come down also. There were a lot of speakers and so much information in every aspect concerning the migrants seeking a safe harbor. It brings to mind, to me, the poem at the base of the Statue of Liberty. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free. One of the speakers presented a picture showing a family walking across. His presentation was called, How Many Borders Have They Crossed? And this family was a mother and a father, and the mother was holding a child who had a halo. To me, it represented the Holy Family. However, they were dressed in today's clothing. And they were walking through a desolate area, maybe a desert, who knows. And the faces were determination to keep their child safe and keep going to someplace. In the case of Jesus and Mary and Joseph, they were going to Egypt to be safe. This presenter also emphasized that we all came from across the border, with the exception of the Native Americans. And if you think back to your ancestors or even yourself, how many borders did you have to cross to get here? And what was your experience? Probably nowhere near what these people are going through. We heard from representatives from the Tohono O'odham and Pasquayaqui tribes. The Pasquayaqis have a little village up in Tucson, and the representative from there explained to us that many also live in Mexico on the other side of on the other side of the Nogales Wall in Sonora, Mexico, as well as across the border into the greater part of Mexico and on down. So that's a little difficult for them to be able to get back and forth to visit other relatives and friends also. The Tohono O'odham live in the southwestern part of Tucson, with a portion still on the Mexican side. There is an invisible line dividing them from their neighbors and friends on the Mexican side, and it makes it difficult for families to go back and forth. The lady who was speaking to us about their experience living there had been asked if they were afraid of the Border Patrol because of stories of some of the things that they do that are not right, like emptying the water bottles. And she said no, they were not afraid because, for the most part, they have not had a whole lot of trouble like that. They have been feeling safe, knowing that they're in the area. However, she did explain another incident that happened. Someone in the family, a child in the family, heard knocking at the door of her residence. And the child, all the children had been told, don't answer the door. So the knocking continued, and the child kept saying, there's somebody at the door. It looks like soldiers. They are soldiers. So an adult went to the door to see what was going on, and by that time they had already started to walk away. These people were not soldiers. They were dressed in camouflage like soldiers would be, but they were apparently someone who wanted to get in the house to, steal food, steal people, whatever, but they had gone away, so they were safe. But if the child had opened the door, who knows what would have happened. This is how they live. And I can't imagine having to live being afraid to answer a door, or knowing that there are people trying to come over and do us harm. So many people trying to alleviate the problems at the border, but they need help. And currently, we here at St. Stephen's are providing some supplies to those down in Agua Prieta through a Presbyterian group called Frontera de Cristo. And that's the gray box that you see out on the porch. But that's only a Band-Aid. We heard from the bishops of San Diego, Western Mexico, Northern Mexico, El Salvador, Rio Grande, West Texas, Los Angeles, Texas, and 2 representatives from the Lutheran Social Services, as well as United Church of Christ. They too are, everything that they do is also a Band-Aid, although they're doing good work, but there's no solution to the problem yet. And I would like to remind you from the words from Exodus 23, verse 9. You must not oppress the strangers. You know how a stranger feels, for you have lived as strangers in the land of Egypt. And of course, the 2 greatest commandments. Jesus said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with your mind, with all your strength. And the 2nd commandment is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. How many borders have you crossed? And who is your neighbor?
Dottie and Allison and I didn't compare notes before we gave our remarks last night, so I was kind of pleased to realize I changed my mind about what I was going to talk about Friday morning. Otherwise, I would have been the 3rd one telling you about Jose Antonio Elena Rodriguez, who was murdered at the border by Border Patrol agent Lonnie Schwartz in, I think it was 2012, 2010. Clearly, we were all deeply touched by that story because we all spent a lot of time thinking about, speaking about it. The 3 days we were in Tucson, we heard stories of asylum seekers, the reasons that they leave their countries seeking asylum in America, the challenges they face getting to our southern border, and the nightmares that assault them once they get here. It was too much information and emotion for 3 weeks, let alone 3 days. It was overwhelming to hear the stories and take in the information, let alone trying to imagine living some of these stories. In the week that's followed, I've done a lot of praying and processing and some research, and today I want to share with you one story in particular and then some of the research that I've done this past week. Deacon Roger Babneau from St. Andrews, as everyone's already told you, operates a ministry called Cruzando Fronteras, Crossing Borders. And they provide shelter, meals, clothing, and many other necessities to the asylees waiting for processing on the others to get across the border. And this process can take months. And when Deacon Babneau goes out seeking support for Cruzando Fronteras, he's frequently told that you're just applying bandages. And he responds with this story, which I will paraphrase badly. Following a Civil War battle, a woman looked out on the carnage in the fields around her house, and she began shredding sheets. She sent members of her household to ask neighbors to do the same, and they met on the battlefield, and using those shredded sheets, started trying to bind the wounds of the fallen soldiers. This woman's name was Clara Barton, and this story is considered the birth of the American Red Cross. Yet Clara and her neighbors were just applying bandages. Cruzando Fronteras needs as much support as we can give them. I think we have people here who collect donations that take down to Nogales on a regular basis. They need food, bottled water, cash, clothing of all sizes, diapers, crayons, coloring books. They probably also need sheets. That's something we can do to continue to be of service to God's children who are suffering at our back doors. One of the topics that received a lot of discussion were the detention facilities, their conditions, their capacities, the fact that most were built to house single men, and the impact that the changing demographic of immigrants and asylum seekers is having, mainly the extraordinary increase in the number of women and children approaching the border. Just a couple of weeks ago, Congress released billions of dollars, much of which is earmarked to go into improving these facilities and building more of them. And seemingly overnight, huge facilities in the form of tent cities have started springing up on both sides of the borders. And this really bothered me. How, with the stroke of a pen, do 1,000-bed facilities spring up seemingly overnight? And that became the focus of my research for most of this last week. It turns out that almost all of our immigration holding centers are owned and operated by the for-profit prison industry. They had contracts in place with trucks loaded and ready to go, just waiting for that check from Congress to drop. If you haven't really thought about the for-profit prison industry, I'd like you to take a moment to think about it now. This is a multi-billion-dollar industry designed to profit off of human bondage. Contracts for these facilities were in place and huge advance investments were made. These tent cities are going up on both sides of the border, so yay, Mexico is helping pay for it. And many of these contracts have no requirement for educational opportunities, skills training, or entertainment. We're holding people for months, sometimes years, and they have nothing to do but sit and wait. They're waiting for solutions. They're waiting for permission to be Americans. I suspect they might also be waiting for bandages. I wrote all of this on Friday and decided I was done and set it aside. Saturday morning, I was doing some of my reading for EFM, and I checked my cell phone and realized I'd had a text message from Allison reminding us that we were going to do this weekend and asking us to look for a way to share to connect our reflections and remarks with our spirituality. And I looked back at my notes and said, yeah, no, I can't do that, because my experience over the week has been, when I look at where God and Christianity meets with the things that I've just spoken about, I despair, and I think we're all going to hell and we deserve to. And then I go into a really, really black pit that's very hard for me to get out of. So I thought about this for a few minutes, and I said, yeah, no, I can't talk about God and what I just talked about. And so I went back to the book that I had been reading before I saw Allison's text. And the next two paragraphs were this. The strength to forgive even mortal enemies is one of the most convincing witnesses of the resurrection. Facing their own imminent death, the martyrs frequently offer such powerful testimony. Jesus forgave his enemies from the cross. St. Stephen, the first martyr, echoes his words as he is stoned to death. In our own time, the martyred prior of the Cistercian monastery in Algeria forgave his killer in advance in an extraordinary letter discovered only after his death. In March of 1996, he and 6 of his brothers were kidnapped by Islamic extremists during a civil war. 2 months later, they were killed under ambiguous circumstances. During the war, the monks had refused to take sides, maintaining the pacifist stance of love towards everyone. This position infuriated all contestants for power, and the brothers knew their days were numbered. Still, they did not flee, but maintained their quiet witness of their common life of worship, prayer, and service to their Muslim neighbors. In his testament, the prior of the community disclaims any pretense of personal innocence, aware that the evil of the world, now convulsing his beloved Algeria, is a part of him too. In the same remarkable letter, he also addressed his future killer. I have lived long enough to know that I share in the evil which seems, alas, to prevail in the world, even in that which would strike me blindly. I should like, when the time comes, to have a clear space which would allow me to beg forgiveness of God and of all my fellow human beings, and at the same time to forgive with all my heart the one who would strike me down. And you also, the friend of my final moment, who would not be aware of what you are doing. Yes, for you also I wish this thank you, this adieu, to commend you to the God whose face I see in you.
So as we enter into the Advent season and we reflect on how the Holy Family once had to flee from death at the hands of King Herod into Egypt, can we see Jesus and Mary and Joseph in those who now flee to our borders? Can we find ways to help them? Yes, we can. We can learn more about what is happening in the laws and the regulations. We can educate ourselves. We can support various organizations and churches that seek to take care of those seeking asylum. We can call and write our representatives and let them know of our concerns. We can donate our time and money and talents. Out on the porch you will find copies of this. It's a multi-page document that has information on all of these, on how to educate yourself, how to find organizations to support, how to find places where you can do some time and give your talents to those that might need them. We can do any and all of those things, or we can ignore it. We can turn away, say it isn't our problem, and wonder, what will Jesus say on that day when he returns to judge the living and the dead?